War is an algorithm. We will show its price. In Myanmar, 49% of households in Shan State grow opium. Not because they chose it, because the financial return from poppy is 17 times higher than rice. The legal economy contracted 18% in a single year. The illegal one expanded to fill the gap. This is not crime. This is substitution. When a legitimate economy collapses, an illegitimate one does not wait. It moves in within months. It employs millions. It generates revenue that no central bank tracks and no budget captures. And it becomes, over time, more stable than the government it replaced. We are going to calculate what that looks like, in dollars, in GDP, and in the structural damage it inflicts on any future attempt to rebuild. The black market is not the exception, it is the response. Every conflict produces the same pattern. The formal economy shrinks, tax collection collapses, employment disappears, populations need income to survive. The informal economy provides it through smuggling, trafficking, black market trade, and illicit resource extraction. This is not opportunism. It is rational behavior under irrational conditions. The shadow economy is, in economic terms, the market's response to state failure. The question is not whether this happens. It always happens. The question is, how large does it get, who controls it, and how permanently does it reshape the country's economic structure? Myanmar, the world's largest drug economy, meets its civil war. Myanmar is the case study. Before the 2021 coup, the country was a low-income economy, with a GDP of roughly $76 billion. After the coup, the economy contracted by 18% in 2021 alone. By 2024, formal GDP had shrunk to approximately $70 billion. Poverty reached nearly 50% of the population. Into this vacuum, the drug economy expanded without restraint. According to the UNODC's 2024 Myanmar Opium Survey, opium cultivation covered 45,200 hectares in 2024. By 2025, that figure rose to 53,100 hectares, a 17% increase in a single year. Myanmar now produces over 90% of all opium in Southeast Asia. Fresh opium prices have more than doubled since 2019, from $145 per kilogram to $329 per kilogram. The opium economy alone is worth between $641 million and $1.05 billion, roughly 0.9 to 1.4% of Myanmar's 2024 GDP. But opium is only one layer. UNODC has described Myanmar as the world's largest methamphetamine producer. The synthetic drug market operates on an industrial scale, distributed by land, sea, and air across Asia and the Pacific. The total value of Myanmar's illicit drug economy, including methamphetamine, ketamine, and other synthetic drugs, is estimated in the tens of billions of dollars when measured at street value in destination markets. Beyond drugs, Myanmar's jade industry, concentrated in Kachin State, generates revenues estimated at $5 to $10 billion annually, almost entirely unregulated and untaxed. Illegal logging, wildlife trafficking, and human smuggling networks have expanded simultaneously. The shadow economy is not a supplement to Myanmar's formal GDP. It is, for millions of people, the only economy that exists. They said, sanctions and international pressure will force the military junta to reform. They got a military regime that controls access to natural resources whose dollar value has actually increased relative to the civilian population. The junta captures jade revenues. It taxes drug flows at key choke points. The civilian population grows opium because it is the only crop that pays. The system is self-sustaining. Syria, Captagon, and the war economy. Syria provides a different variant of the same mechanism. Before 2011, Syria's shadow economy was estimated at roughly 19 to 22% of GDP, close to the global average. By the middle of the Civil War, the informal economy had become the dominant economic structure. The most striking example is Captagon, an addictive amphetamine that Syria became the primary producer and exporter of during the conflict. At its peak, the Captagon trade generated over $9 billion annually, according to estimates cited by multiple institutional sources. That figure exceeds Syria's entire official GDP in 2023, which stood at approximately $17.5 billion. Captagon was not produced in a vacuum. It was produced by regime networks, funded by armed groups, and distributed through smuggling channels that crossed international borders. The trade funded the war, while the war created the conditions that made the trade possible. This is the feedback shadow economies produce in conflict zones. The illicit economy funds the conflict, and the conflict funds the illicit economy. Beyond Captagon, Syria's war economy included fuel smuggling, looting of archaeological sites, kidnapping for ransom, and control of border crossings by armed factions. The World Bank estimated that 1/3 of Syria's housing stock and 1/2 of its health and education facilities were destroyed. GDP fell from $60 billion in 2010 to $17.5 billion in 2023. But the wealth did not simply disappear. It was redistributed from the formal economy into the hands of whoever controlled the shadow economy. Iran, sanctions as the engine of informality. Iran presents a third model. Decades of sanctions have not collapsed the Iranian economy. They have informalized it. Iran's shadow economy is estimated at 30 to 40% of GDP, one of the highest rates in the world, according to estimates from the World Bank and the IMF. The mechanism is structural. Sanctions block legitimate trade channels. Businesses adapt by routing transactions through third countries, using shell companies, and operating in cash. Over decades, this adaptation becomes the norm. The informal economy is no longer a workaround. It is the system. Iranian smuggling networks operate across multiple continents. Sanctions evasion has become an industry in itself, with intermediaries, brokers, and financial networks that handle billions of dollars in annual transactions. The Revolutionary Guard's economic empire, which encompasses shipping, construction, telecommunications, and trade, operates largely outside the formal tax and regulatory system. The structural lock-in. The shadow economy does not disappear when conflict ends. This is the critical point. It persists because it has become structurally embedded in the country's economic architecture. In Syria, analysts warn that elements of the wartime economy, militia-controlled resources, smuggling routes, rubble clearance contracts, will persist into the recovery phase unless the state reasserts control over these channels. But the state, by definition, lacks the capacity to do so. The people who control the shadow economy are, in many cases, the same people who control territory. In Myanmar, the drug trade has created permanent economic infrastructure, cultivation networks, processing facilities, transportation routes, and distribution channels that cannot be dismantled by a government that does not control the territory where they operate. Ethnic armed organizations that govern autonomous enclaves have built economies around casinos, gambling platforms, and resource extraction. These are not temporary wartime measures. They are permanent economic systems. The tax revenue that never existed. The fiscal cost of shadow economy growth is compounding. In Syria, tax collection collapsed by more than 80% during the war. In Myanmar, the formal tax base has shrunk to a fraction of its pre-coup level. Every dollar that flows through the informal economy is a dollar that generates no tax revenue, no employment data, no economic statistics. This creates a measurement problem that persists for decades after conflict ends. Official GDP figures understate actual economic activity, but the activity that exists is untaxed, unregulated, and controlled by actors whose interests are incompatible with state reconstruction. Rebuilding a formal economy on top of a functioning informal one is not simply a matter of investment and infrastructure. It requires dismantling economic networks that are, by definition, resistant to state authority. The final calculation. Myanmar. Shadow economy worth tens of billions at street value. Formal GDP contracted 18% in 1 year. Opium cultivation at a decade high and rising. Syria. Captagon trade alone generated $9 billion annually at its peak, more than half the country's official GDP. Total GDP fell 70% over 14 years. Iran. Shadow economy at 30 to 40% of GDP after decades of sanctions. Formal channels have been permanently replaced by informal alternatives. War does not destroy economic activity. It redirects it, from taxed to untaxed, from regulated to unregulated, from the state to whoever fills the vacuum. And the vacuum, once filled, does not empty itself. Subscribe to What War Costs. The economy that survives war is never the one that existed before it.